Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again, and thank you, Dr. Khalid, for holding these lectures. As usual, the attendance link is going to be in the comments section, and if you have any questions, just post them in the comments, and inshallah, we'll go through them at the end of the session. And without further ado, we're ready when you are, Dr. Khalid, inshallah.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Again, welcome to everyone for joining us in this session and this courses or this series of classes on the history of Bayt al-Maqdis. We started right from the beginning. We've covered, we're now in the 6th class, and we've covered a few hundred thousand years. And now we come, in the rest of the session, we will cover the last 1,000 years of Bayt al-Maqdis. Last week, if we are able to see the screen, last week we discussed the Fath of Umar ibn Khattab to Bayt al-Maqdis, and then we went from there to discuss the Umayyad period, and we discussed a number of issues. I'm not sure if you are able to see the screen. Is the screen visible, Noura?
No.
Okay. If we are able to, hopefully within the next few minutes, you will be able to see it, inshallah. We started with how the Muslims created for the first time in the history of Bayt al-Maqdis a multicultural society where everyone was able to live side by side. And this is the first the first time that Muslims, Christians, and Jews were able to live side by side in Bayt al-Maqdis, and how Umar ibn Khattab created this society based on the Islamic vision for this land. This vision was based on the Quranic concept of inclusivity for this land, and as we have mentioned, that the Quran mentions this place, the barakah of this place is for the whole world, not just for the Muslims. And we discussed a number of verses, particularly from the chapter Al-Anbiya, where it clearly mentions that this land, in verse 71, that this land is Lil Alameen. And as we quoted Karen Armstrong, who talked about that the Muslims were faithful to the inclusive vision, they could have made this exclusively Muslim, but they allowed everyone to be within this land. And this was changing. It changed the trend of exclusivity that existed just before the Muslims and for centuries before. Particularly in the same century, in the 7th century, the Persians occupied Bayt al-Maqdis in the year 614. And we discussed this because the Quran paid interest to this in Surah Al-Rum. And we discussed how the Persians burned down the churches, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Nia Church. Many churches were burned down to the ground or razed to the ground. And Jews who came with the Persians took revenge from the Byzantine Romans, who have expelled them from this area for 500 years. So they would go and slaughter Christians like sheep, as we see from primary sources from that time. When Heraclius, the Byzantines, came back in 628, they did the same thing to the Jews and expelled them once again. And we come back to Umar ibn Khattab. Umar ibn Khattab could have done the same thing and expelled both the Jews and the Christians, but the Muslims saw that this is not the case, and it was the most peaceful and bloodless conquest in that area. And the Muslims established a system that enabled Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live in Bayt al-Maqdis side by side for the first time. And we talked about how Umar ibn Khattab rebuilt the area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was outside the city, on the original foundations, and he constructed a building inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa known as Jami' Umar, or Umar's mosque. And even after Umar ibn Khattab, this continued with the endowment of Uthman, and later on the Umayyad, who took care of the area of Bayt al-Maqdis. So after the period of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, which continued for 30, 40 years, following that, the Umayyads took power. And we said that the Umayyads have been presented in historical books in quite a negative manner, but their work actually speaks for them. What they did inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the reconstruction of the whole area, and the different levels inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa, starting from the basements, the Marwanid basement, to al-Jami' al-Aqsa, to the Dome of the Rock, to the Dome of the Chain, to the Dome of the Miraj, to numerous buildings that were constructed. And the walls of al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the gates, actually most of them date back to this period. Also, they built massive Umayyad palaces south of al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and constructed minarets and various constructions within al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So not just the Dome of the Rock was constructed by the Umayyads, but the whole compound was constructed in the 7th century. Abdul Malik, it wasn't just the idea of reviving al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Actually, it went further to Islamizing the whole system within this land. The coins, the golden dinars that were struck, had the writing La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah, wa la ilaha illallah wahdahu Muhammad Rasulullah, with an image of the Khalif, in this case that you see here in front of you, an image of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And the construction of the roads, the construction of milestones, various constructions, even the archives had been established. And from the primary sources that have reached us, like the letters of Qurra ibn Sharik, we see that actually the Umayyads were continued on the path of Umar ibn Khattab in dealing with non-Muslims in Bayt al-Maqdis. The building of the Dome of the Rock was completed, and most of al-Masjid al-Aqsa, before the end of the 7th century. So by 691, 692, the area was completed. And this was followed by many of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ who had settled in this place. Many of them started to be buried in this area, particularly after the plague of Amwas, which happened a few years after the Fath of Bayt al-Maqdis by Umar ibn al-Khattab. And we mentioned many of these points during our last discussion. Following the Umayyads, we see numerous Muslim dynasties who were in Bayt al-Maqdis, namely the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Tolonis, the Ikhshidis, the Seljuks, the Artuklus, the many Muslim dynasties ruled in Bayt al-Maqdis and had numerous examples in this area. During the beginning of the 8th century, 747, an earthquake hit the holy city, and it destroyed many parts of Al-Aqsa Mosque and even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They were severely damaged, and many of the Abbasid Khalif came to this area and renovated the sites within Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Great Muslim scholars and most of the scholars of Hadith passed by Bayt al-Maqdis and stopped and took knowledge from the area of Bayt al-Maqdis. Great mystics like Rabi' al-Adawiyya, it is said that she settled in Bayt al-Maqdis and she died there. Many women, companions and even wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and tabi'een, women settled or visited Bayt al-Maqdis, like Safiya, the wife of Rasulullah ﷺ. And we mentioned an article that you can read on the role of women in Bayt al-Maqdis. One of the gates of al-Masjid al-Aqsa was named after one of these women, the gate of Dar Khalid. And we said this gate here that you see in front of you was named the Triple Gate, with three gates were named after Maryam alayhi salam, because her mihrab was to the east of this area, the southern eastern corner of al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So many places were named after these prophets and after these great men and women. Also, Ata ibn Muslim al-Khurasani, a great scholar and mufassir, he died in Bayt al-Maqdis in 752. Al-Mansur, the Abbasid Khalif, visited Bayt al-Maqdis in 757, 758. And there was major construction and repairs, renovations to what the Umayyads had constructed. And one particular building they paid a lot of attention to was Al-Jami' al-Aqsa, the Solemn building. The reason why they paid a lot of attention to this is built on a basement, and much of it actually fell during the earthquake. So the Abbasid added a dome on top of it. They changed the nave, and they shortened the building, which was much bigger than it was at that time. By the end of the 8th century, there was another earthquake, and Al-Aqsa again was damaged, and the Abbasid Khalif Al-Mahdi visited Bayt al-Maqdis, and he said something quite interesting. He was fascinated by the Umayyad building of the Dome of the Rock, and he said, the Umayyads actually beat us to building such a wonderful building, and he restored the area. At the beginning of the 9th century, Abdullah ibn Tahir, the governor of Syria at that time, built the porticos in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And following that, we have the time of Khalif Al-Ma'mun, who orders the restoration of the Qubbat al-Sakhra, and he reconstructs much of the area of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa that has been damaged. But what we see quite interesting in this period is many structures have been built to remember or in commemoration of great prophets or the Quranic stories, like the Mihrab of Zakaria. This is the modern Mihrab of Zakaria, but it used to be in the northern area of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So taking the the Quranic concepts and transferring them into actual buildings and actual structures. This is the Mahd of Isa, or the dome of the cradle of Jesus. and the Mihrab of Maryam. And this was constructed in remembrance of Maryam alayhi salam, as with the gate, and also in remembrance of Isa alayhi salam. Many other gates and buildings were built in remembrance for many of these great prophets and their Quranic references. During the time of Al-Ma'mun, in the year 832, he did a few things, a few changes in the city. He's the first one to introduce the name Al-Quds, and you can actually see it here minted on a coin. If you are able to read Arabic, you can read it upside down: Alif, Lam, Qaf, Dal, and Sin. Al-Quds was written or minted on a coin, and the rest of it says Muhammadur Rasulullah, La ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. There is no God but Allah, the one, and he has no partners. And here Muhammad is his messenger. Multiculturalism continued in the area of Bayt al-Maqdis during these periods, and we see this with the different dynasties that ruled Bayt al-Maqdis. The Abbasid had the first 100 years were quite the Abbasid were relatively strong, but following that it started to decline, and we have numerous changes happening across the whole of the Muslim world. We said during the time of Al-Ma'mun, the rise of the Mu'tazila took place in the capital of the Abbasid in Baghdad, and during that time this name changed. Actually, at that time Al-Ma'mun did something quite unbelievable inside the Dome of the Rock. He wanted, as we mentioned, Al-Mahdi said that the Umayyads beat us to the construction of the Dome of the Rock. So what he does, he changes the name of the city to Al-Quds, and then he changes the name of the constructor of the building of the Dome of the Rock. So instead of the name Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he changes the name and he places his name, Al-Ma'mun, inside the building of the Dome of the Rock. Let me just show you this book by Ole Grabar. He discusses the building of the Dome of the Rock. Actually, it's quite a detailed book. And inside the Dome of the Rock, we talked about the different mosaics that were there inside this structure. So on one of these mosaics, where it used to have the name of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he changes it and he places his own name to do this, and this is unacceptable in any sense. However, this is something that did take place, and the mistake that he did is he forgot to change the date. So on the writing, it says that this building was constructed in the year 772. In the year 72, may Allah accept from him. And then he changes this and he squeezes his name, Abdullah al-Imam al-Ma'mun, Amir al-Mu'mineen. So you can actually see this in the writing inside the Dome of the Rock today, that the name has been changed by al-Ma'mun. And there was numerous fitnas at that time. One of them against particularly Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who stood against the Mu'tazili's point of view that the Quran was created, and he was punished by al-Ma'mun and he was imprisoned for a long time until and he was tortured while he was in prison to accept this idea. This started the decline of the Abbasids, and by the middle or the last quarter of the 9th century, we see changes taking place inside the area of in the area of the Muslim Khilafah, the Abbasid, and we have numerous powers starting to take over. So the Khalif becomes more symbolic, and the rule is transferred to various different smaller dynasties who are governing in the name of the Abbasids. One of them, this started in the year 877, when the Abbasid appointed Ahmad bin Tolun to be the governor of Egypt, and then he extends his power to Bayt al-Maqdis and Palestine, and he continues. The Tulunis continue to rule until 905. So they continued for close to 30 years. And during their period, actually, it was quite, in terms of the multicultural society in Bayt al-Maqdis continued to exist. Following the end of the rule of the Tulunids in Bayt al-Maqdis, the first Abbasid governor in Egypt again, after his name was Isa bin Musa al-Nawashiri. He asks to be buried in Bayt al-Maqdis, and this then becomes a custom that most of the rulers want to be buried in Bayt al-Maqdis, and this is related to something that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions. We mentioned many of the Sahaba are literally buried just on the outside of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Many of the other governors also asked for this the same to be done to them, and many of these governors, as we will come to see, were buried in that area. After this, the mother of one of the Abbasid Khalif Al-Muqtadir, she orders the reconstructions of the gates of the dome of the rock, and by 940, so we're into the 10th century, Muhammad al-Ikhshid, the founder of the Ikhshidi state in Egypt, he takes over Palestine and Bayt al-Maqdis, and Bayt al-Maqdis becomes a very important part of his governing, and this continues from that period for a few decades. And during this period, all the Ikhshidi governors would ask that their graves are in Bayt al-Maqdis, and their graves today are in the just outside where this minaret that you see here, the minaret of in the northern part of at the Bab al-Asbat, in the right hand side as you are leaving, or in the left hand side when you are entering Bab al-Asbat, you will find the graves of the Ikhshidi governors of Egypt and Bayt al-Maqdis, all being buried in that area. So starting with the Muhammad al-Ikhshidi, and then also other governors such as Takin ibn Abdullah and others, all are asked to be buried in Bayt al-Maqdis. Even the brothers of these governors and their families asked to be buried in Bayt al-Maqdis. Also, the Ikhshidis spent a considerable amount of their wealth to rebuild or to renovate Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, as we see with the minister of the Ikhshidis who ordered the restoration of al-Masjid al-Aqsa in 960. We see that the Ikhshidis finish their rule a few decades later. We said they started in 940. By 970, the rule had ended in Bayt al-Maqdis. And this starts the Fatimid period. The Fatimids, who were Shia, starting from northern Africa, extended their power to Egypt and got rid of the Ikhshidis. And then they established Al-Azhar University to spread the Shia doctrine across the Muslim world. In 970, by the end of the 10th century, they take over Bayt al-Maqdis, and their rule continues until the time of the Seljuks. So from 970, this continues all the way to 1070, roughly. So for 100 years, the area of Bayt al-Maqdis is under Fatimid rule. During this period, we have the great Muslim geographer, one of the greatest geographers of the world, al-Maqdisi, al-Bishari. He lived during this period, and he gives us description of what was the situation in Bayt al-Maqdis. He mentions that the majority of the inhabitants were actually Christian, and there was also many Jews. The Sunni Muslims were persecuted, and he said during that time there was very little Islamic knowledge in the city and even inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and the fuqaha were abandoned, and there was not much for them. However, in terms of non-Muslims living in the city, as we said, they continued to be the majority, particularly the Christians. But also during this period, it was relatively good for the Christians until the turn of the millennium. If you remember, and many of you would remember this, in the year 1999, so 22 years ago or 23 years ago, people at the turn of the millennium, 1999, were saying that the world would end in the year 2000. And the same thing happened in the year 999. And people were, Christians from all over the world came and waiting for the return of the Messiah. And large numbers were in Bayt al-Maqdis waiting for this to happen. And Al-Hakim, the Fatimid ruler, took many measures against the Christian, particularly 9 years after this. So in the year 1009, the Fatimid Khalif, who his mother was Christian, and his maternal uncles are all Christian. She was a Christian, so he didn't have anything against Christianity per se. However, he destroyed the church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he takes many measures against Christians. But a few years later, 5 years later, he revokes these measures, and he orders about 10 years later that it can be, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre can be rebuilt. And also the Fatimids rebuilt parts of the Masjid al-Aqsa due to numerous earthquakes, and during the time of Al-Hakim, he restored the area of the Dome of the Rock and other structures within the area in agreement with the Byzantine state. The Church of Resurrection, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was completed the rebuilding of it. However, the changing point in that ended the Fatimid rule in Bayt al-Maqdis started with the rise of the Seljuks. The Seljuks, particularly after the battle in Malazgirt in Anatolia in 1071, the Seljuks were associated with the Abbasids, and with their rise, the start of the fall of the Fatimid in Bayt al-Maqdis started to take place. In 1072, a Turkmen under Atsiz took Bayt al-Maqdis from the Fatimids, and it continued to be in their hands until the arrival of the Crusades. So from 1072 all the way to 1098, it continued to be in the hands of the Seljuks and later the Artukids. Most of these dynasties that I've mentioned, starting from the Ptolomies, the Ikhshidis, and now the Seljuks, they were from Turkic origin, Turkmen. So they started, however, at that time, the issue of being Turkish or Arab or Kurdish was not an issue. The idea of nationalism was not the issue of that time. It didn't become an issue until many centuries later. So we see that from the time 1072, when the Seljuks took Bayt al-Maqdis, changes started to take place. However, there was numerous changes that the people were not too happy with during the early Seljuk period in Bayt al-Maqdis, and particularly Tutush, who was the governor of Damascus. He came and he tried to resolve the problems that were created by Atsiz. This issue was resolved by Tutush, who was the governor of the Seljuks for the whole of Syria, and he handed over the rule of Bayt al-Maqdis to Artuk bin Aksab. Artuk, he is the one that started the Artukid dynasty, and he took Bayt al-Maqdis and resolved the problems that were caused by the early Seljuks, and he re-established order in the city. And during the rest of the years before the Crusades, this is when Bayt al-Maqdis became the center, a center for knowledge again, and cultural life, educational life was revived in every sense. I will try to finish this period within the next 5 minutes. So if there are any questions before we move to the Crusades, particularly on the Abbasid, the Ikhshidis, the Ptolomies, the Fatimids, and the Seljuks and the Artuklus, if there are any questions, we can take them now and then continue with the build-up to the Crusade. During the time of the Artukids, we have great scholars who come to Bayt al-Maqdis. Educational life after 100 years of the Fatimids, who suppressed Muslim Sunni scholars. We have the revival of Islamic knowledge in Bayt al-Maqdis by the Seljuks and the Artukids. And the Artukids, during their period, we have great scholars like Imam al-Ghazali coming to visit Bayt al-Maqdis, Ibn al-Arabi coming on his way to Hajj from North Africa, from Andalusia, and then through North Africa. He was going to Hajj, and then he stopped in Bayt al-Maqdis. And when he saw the amount of scholars and the amount of knowledge that is in Bayt al-Maqdis, he changed his course and decided to stay in Bayt al-Maqdis for another 3 years. So instead of just a quick visit, he decides to delay his Hajj for 3 years and spend these 3 years gaining knowledge from the scholars in Bayt al-Maqdis. And there were great Muslim scholars like Tartushi, Ghazali, and others based in Bayt al-Maqdis. So it was a great opportunity for Ibn al-Arabi to seek knowledge and learn from them. So he spent the 3 years in that place, and it was a place unlike any other place in the Muslim world. It wasn't just for Islamic knowledge. It was there. There were debates with Christians and Jews, with different Muslim sects. Everyone was present there, and everyone was promoting his ideas freely, and there was discussions, and there was various different development taking place inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, particularly, and the city of Jerusalem, and the whole region, the Holy Land at large. And we have great names who were teaching inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa at that time. And there is a saying that Imam al-Ghazali actually says that he was really disheartened to see only 300 circles of knowledge in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. 300 circles of 300 teachers teaching. So Al-Aqsa was not just a masjid, it was a university at that time. 300 teachers teaching at the same time inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And Imam al-Ghazali was mainly based around the area of the gate of Rahma. And he, you can see in the eastern part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, Imam al-Ghazali spent his i'tikaf. Today, the gate of Rahma, it was closed for a few decades. The Muslims could not enter it for nearly 19 years. 2-3 years ago, the Muslims managed to re-access, because there was claims that Zionists were wanting to turn it into a synagogue. So the Muslims every day now re-pray inside this area. The same also happened with the southern area of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, which they wanted also to turn into a place for Jewish prayer inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So this is the place where Imam al-Ghazali used to make his i'tikaf, and he used to be within this area. This was one of, because we have lots of sources coming from that time, and we see Imam al-Ghazali writing Ihya Ulumuddin, or some say actually Ihya Ulumuddin was completed in Damascus, but other books like Al-Risala Al-Qudsiyya was written inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. At least we know this because Imam al-Ghazali mentions this in his writing, that this was written while he was inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And Imam al-Ghazali developed many different ideas together with the Seljuk great wazir, who was at that time developing schools, Nizamiya schools across the whole of the Muslim world, and he commissioned its first development with Imam al-Ghazali. And after this, Imam al-Ghazali comes and he settles for some time in Bayt al-Maqdis, and around the Crusader time he leaves that area. The Artuki period in Bayt al-Maqdis finishes with the Egyptians, particularly the Fatimids, coming and taking the city in 1098. In 1098, the Fatimids strike a deal with, and we will discuss this in some detail after we take any questions on this, strike a deal with the Crusaders that their common enemy, the Seljuks and the Artukids, they will fight against them, one from the north and one from the south. With this ends the Seljuki, Artuki rule in Bayt al-Maqdis in 1098, just 1 year before the Crusaders storm the city of Bayt al-Maqdis and massacre tens of thousands of Muslims inside the area of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Noura, if we have any questions on this, we can stop here for 5 minutes and take any questions that relate to this period. We try to cover it very quickly so we can then move to the next topic. So if there are any questions, we can take them and then continue our discussion, inshallah.
Yeah, we have one question so far, and that's asking about the first earthquake, when it happened, if it was in the Abbasid era or which period.
Yes, the first earthquake that hit Palestine after the Umayyad period happened in the year 747, at the beginning of the Abbasid period. And this caused damage to the whole area of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and also to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They were severely damaged. And then Abu Ja'far al-Mansur starts the reparations. So at the end of the Umayyad period, with the rise of the Abbasid, this is when the first earthquake actually hits the area of Bayt al-Maqdis. And Abu Ja'far al-Mansur comes himself to Bayt al-Maqdis and starts the reparation and the renovations of that, followed by other Abbasid Khalif like al-Mahdi, who also visited Bayt al-Maqdis, and al-Ma'mun, and others who have done that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. We have one other question. It says, how many years passed between the Umayyad period to the Seljuk period?
Okay, we have a few centuries from the end of the Umayyads. The Umayyads continued in Andalus, but they ended in the eastern Muslim countries, in Bilad al-Sham and Egypt and North Africa and Iraq. This ended by around 750 with the rise of the Abbasi. So let's say from 750 till until when is the question?
Seljuk period.
The beginning of the Seljuk or the end of the Seljuk period?
I'm assuming the beginning.
Okay, if it's until the beginning, then it will be 1072, and this was, let's say, 750, so around 3 centuries between them. If we calculate it from the end of the Umayyad until the end of the Seljuk Artuki period, that's about 350 years between them. So we're talking about a few centuries of different dynasties who ruled Bayt al-Maqdis. But if we look at it from the time of Umar ibn Khattab until the Crusade, we're talking about 461 or 62 years, 460 years. So nearly 5 centuries of Muslim rule inside Bayt al-Maqdis from the time of Umar until the time of the Crusades.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
All the questions? No, that's
okay.
all. Thank you.
Okay, then let's get into the second part of our discussion, which is the Crusader period. I will share the screen again. I hope it's visible. Yes, the Crusader period continued in Bayt al-Maqdis for close to a century. And parts of the Crusaders actually continued for 2.5 centuries in the region. However, the Crusader inside Bayt al-Maqdis, they continued for close to a century. The Crusaders started from Europe around 1095, And I really recommend that you read on the reasons for the Crusades, and read particularly Pope Urban II's sermon, in which he called the Christians to come and fight the infidels, the Muslims, in these lands. He made numerous claims on Muslims and what they are doing to the Christians. And this reminds me of the weapons of mass destruction that George Bush and Tony Blair tried to say that Iraq holds before the invasion of Iraq. And we know that all of it was lies. And today, Tony Blair is giving the title Sir for the crimes that he has committed in Iraq. The Crusaders, if you read the sermon, he talks about how the Muslims have what they have done to the Christians, and how they've raped Christian women in the churches, all of which not Muslim or not Christian historical sources confirm any of these lies that were mentioned by the Pope on this issue. The Crusade had many other reasons, as with the war on Iraq. What was behind it was actually oil, and what was behind it, even in the Pope's speech, is that the riches of this land. This is a land that flows with milk and honey. This is a land that can resolve many of the problems that exist in Europe. There was so many different problems within Europe. To export these problems to the East and try to resolve some of these problems. So we see that during the start of the Crusade, and there is a very good documentary that I recommend you to watch by Al Jazeera. It's 3 episodes. It covers this period that we will be discussing. So by next class, if you are able to watch it, it would give you a better understanding of our discussion. And I hope the organizers will share these links with you. They are in Arabic and in English, and also other languages, at least in subtitle. So the start of the Crusades, after the Pope preaches the first sermon, people then start to march. And the first crusade or the popular crusade, was a failure, as the Seljuks managed to stop them before reaching or at the start of Anatolia. Then this is more organized with the first crusades led by knights and princes from different parts of Europe, and they come through Constantinople, today Istanbul, and they start fighting against the Seljuks in these areas. Eventually, they reach Antakya, which is in southern Turkey today, and they go across to Urfa, and they establish the first Crusader county in the region. During this period, something interesting takes place. We know that the Fatimids, there are 2 accounts on this. The first is a Muslim account, which is by Ibn al-Athir, who lived a century later. He mentions actually one of the reasons for the Crusades is that the Fatimids invited the Crusades to come to this land. This hypothesis is very problematic, and there is not enough evidence for it. And there is an article on this by Dr. Maher Abu Munshar discussing this particular hypothesis. However, the second part, which is recorded by Christian chronicles of the Crusades, like William of Tyre, one of the most famous Crusader historians, He mentions that during the siege of Antioch, the Fatimids sent a delegation to meet with the Crusaders and to invite them to collaborate, to work together against the Fatimids, the Seljuks. And this, we have evidence for it from different historical accounts, that during the siege of Antioch, this unfortunate event did take place, and the Fatimids did align themselves with the Crusaders, based on that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they allowed or they collaborated with the Crusaders to do this. However, the Crusaders, it seems that the Fatimids were not fully aware of what the Crusaders were hoping to do, because the Crusaders, their aim was something even greater. Their aim was to reach Bayt al-Maqdis and to take it from the Muslims completely. So their aim was not just to take Antioch. The aim was beyond that. And you can see here in the map in front of you the Crusades, particularly if you concentrate on the First Crusade, that started from different parts in Europe. Some of them continued all the way to Constantinople, and from Constantinople they reached Antioch. You can see it here, and some of them traveled by sea directly. They established the first kingdom here in Edessa, or Urfa today, and then in Antioch. Here, the southern area was in the hands of the Fatimids. The Fatimids took this opportunity and sent ships to meet with the Crusaders in Antioch, that they will attack from the north, and then they will split the land between them. The land of the Seljuks will be split between both the Crusaders and the Fatimids. However, the Crusaders did not give any particular promises to the Fatimids, and this eventually they had to fight against one another before reaching the area of Bayt al-Maqdis. This starting move that took place then turned against the Fatimids, and the Fatimids thought that their alliance with the Crusaders would help them to maintain part of this land. However, it did not materialize, and we see how they were then, according to the Fatimids, they were betrayed by the Crusaders, who they thought that they had an agreement with. The Crusaders continued throughout. Once the Fatimids started attacking from the south, so the Fatimids started attacking from the south against the Seljuks and the Artukids, and from the north it was the Crusaders. So this weakened the Seljuks quite a lot, and then they started to take one city after the other. It wasn't just the Fatimids who were in alliance with the Crusaders. Many of the Muslim rulers in that time, along the way, preferred that they would not engage against the Crusaders, and they wanted to keep their land safe from the Crusades. So they signed agreements with them that they will not attack them and they will let them pass through. So many of the Crusaders passed, the army of the Crusaders from Antioch all the way to Jerusalem was passed without any real resistance from any of the Muslim rulers en route. And this was a blow to the Muslims in a sense that the fall of Jerusalem was relatively easy. The Crusaders now had to fight against the Fatimids. The Fatimids are the ones who control Bayt al-Maqdis. They took it a year earlier from the Seljuks and the Artukids, and they continued towards the city. So the Fatimids had to defend the city against the Crusaders, and the Crusaders mounted a siege on the city that continued for some time. In terms of let's make a quick change to the presentation. Let me show you a video instead. I am apologies. I tried to share something else and then the whole thing stopped. Like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it possible to share a video? Is that possible?
You could try, but...
Okay. Let us try. Let me know if it is working.
Okay. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, I hope you will be able to hear it. It's actually quite a concise video of the First Crusade and the fall of Jerusalem. So it will gives us a different. Instead of me just talking, you will see this. Let's see if the sound actually works.
Okay.
3 long, tough years have passed.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Their homes, answering the Pope's call. But finally, their extraordinary journey, frequently struck by famine, plagues, and desertions, was over. Many disbelieved and wept, seeing the rich domes and high towers of the holy city of Jerusalem appearing on the horizon. The ensuing siege, full of both bravery and atrocity that heavily influenced the history of medieval Europe, is about to commence. Viable reasons for such a state of affairs. Firstly, marching through the arid lands lying south of Antioch during the hot summer wasn't considered a good idea, especially by the poor participants who would likely suffer the most. Secondly, plague descended on the city, which weakened Count Raymond's health and took the life of the papal legate Adhemar de Puy. It was a significant loss for the Latin army, as the cool-headed bishop Adhemar often served as a conciliator in the endless quarrels between the Frankish lords. His death essentially undermined the already fragile cooperation between the leaders, particularly Raymond and Bohemond, who still quarreled over the fate of the recently conquered city. The latter already titled himself as the Prince of Antioch within the safety of the occupied citadel, and refused to participate any further in the expedition. Raymond had obviously made efforts to convince the Norman leader to give up his personal ambitions, and even messaged Emperor Alexius to join the Crusaders and reclaim the city, but to no avail. Thus, the Crusade stalled for months, with the only notable exception being the nearby city of Murat, which was captured in December. Eventually, the unrest among the lower-ranked knights and officers, who threatened their leaders with tearing down the walls of Antioch if they did not resume the crusade, forced Raymond and Godfrey to march out. While the bulk of the Latin army departed Antioch in the middle of January 1099, the now unhindered Bohemond could lay the groundwork for his new domain. Meanwhile, the crusade marched south along the coast and soon found that many petty emirs who, rather than fight the invaders, opted to pay tribute to keep their towns unharmed. The Seljuk Turks already realized that the goal of the crusade was not total conquest, well, at least not directly, but in specifically reclaiming the holy city from Muslim hands. It's worth noting that when the Latin army besieged Antioch in 1098, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt captured Jerusalem and its surroundings. Thus, the Seljuk Turks, who were at war with the Fatimid, had little interest in actually stopping the Crusaders. Consequently, after 5 months of relatively easy travel through Palestine, the Europeans reached the port city of Jaffa, where their route turned inland, straight to Jerusalem. But as soon as they started to move east towards the Holy City, the news about a Fatimid army assembling in Egypt arrived. Additionally, the wells on their way were either buried or poisoned, and many of the trees were cut down. Some uncertainty arose within the Crusader ranks, as the area was inhospitable, their enemies were gathering, and it was again the middle of the blistering summer. But the final goal was so close that even such major concerns couldn't stop them. On the 7th of June, about 2 years since departing Constantinople, the Prince's Crusade eventually reached its final goal, the Holy City of Jerusalem, and set camps around its walls. Just like Antioch the year before, the city was too big to perform a full-fledged siege, so the besiegers divided their forces. Raymond set a camp on the south section of the wall, while Godfrey and the Normans occupied the northern part. Even though many died or left the Crusade throughout the last 2 years, the Latin army still counted around 1,300 knights and 12,000 infantry, a serious threat to even such a well-defended fortress like Jerusalem. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, was well aware of their impending arrival months before and made his best effort to sufficiently prepare for the upcoming siege. The city was well supplied and well defended. Ad-Dawla even had a few hundred skilled light horsemen at his command to harass the invaders. He also expelled all Christians from the city, just to make sure Jerusalem wouldn't suffer the same fate as Antioch, which had fallen due to treachery. Moreover, as mentioned before, the Fatimids made many food and water sources in the area unusable, forcing the Crusaders to travel considerable distances to forage supplies. It was not only tiresome but also risky, as Ad-Dawla's cavalrymen often sallied outside the walls and attacked separated groups of foragers. All these Fatimid countermeasures put pressure on the Crusaders to act quickly, as their supplies dwindled day by day and they feared the arrival of a Muslim relief force from Egypt at any time. The leaders decided to storm the walls on the 13th of June, a week into the siege, even though they badly lacked siege equipment. It is said that the Crusaders had just one scaling ladder at this point, so the attack was essentially doomed to fail. The Crusaders believed that God was with them, but this was not the time for a miracle, as the defenders easily repulsed them. Many were killed, and the storm attempt failed miserably. Speaking of miracles, one of Raymond's priests reportedly had a vision of the deceased Bishop Adama, who rebuked the Crusade leaders for their quarrels and gave instructions how to conquer Jerusalem. The Crusaders had to fast, do a penance, and lead a barefoot procession around the walls for the city to fall in a matter of days. And that is exactly what they did. Either as an act of desperation or extreme piety, it must have been a puzzling sight for the Muslim defenders. Anyway, around that time, several Genoese galleys under the merchant Guglielmo Imbriaco sailed into Jaffa's harbor, some 70 kilometers away. They brought much-needed building materials and skilled woodworkers. The ships were soon dismantled as the Fatimid fleet surrounded the harbor and forced the sailors to join the siege. Praising God for this unexpected aid, the Crusaders constructed 2 siege towers and positioned them near the northern and southern parts of the wall. On the 13th of July, another assault commenced. Raymond led the attack on the southern part of the wall, while Godfrey and the Normans tried to break the Fatimid defense on the northern perimeter. A relentless storm raged throughout the day. Both sides lost many men, but the city stood strong. During the night, Godfrey decided to secretly dismantle the northern siege tower and move to the less defended part of the wall around the Flowers Gate. The next day was again full of atrocities, as the Crusaders didn't cease their storming of the walls. In the afternoon, the Fatimids managed to burn down Raymond's siege tower and repel the enemy. While the situation looked dire on the southern perimeter as Raymond's attack collapsed, Godfrey still pushed on the northern part of the wall. Eventually, after a full day and night of fighting, he broke the defense and opened the gate. Crusaders flooded into the city, which saw fierce fighting break out among its streets and alleys. The defenders of the southern part of the wall also joined the fray, which allowed Raymond's troops to break through the gates. In a matter of minutes, the city's defenses collapsed under the dominant Crusader force, and an indiscriminate slaughter of the Jewish and Muslim population occurred, as many of the princes made little effort to restrain their subordinates from looting and killing. Some of the citizens sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and, for a time, were guarded by Bohemont's nephew, Tancred. But while he was busy in another part of the city, the bloodbath spilled into the mosque as well. The Fatimid governor, Ad-Dawla, surrendered to Raymond with his retinue, and was granted safe passage south. Yet not many had the opportunity to surrender directly to the noble Frankish lord. It's hard to tell exactly how many people were killed in taking the city, but the streets of Jerusalem were awash in blood. Many chroniclers later noted the sheer brutality committed that day, even by medieval standards. Almost 4 years had passed since Pope Urban ignited the idea of a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. And finally, their ultimate goal was accomplished. Yet the story doesn't end there. A formidable army commanded by Fatimid Vizier Al-Afdal was already marching through Sinai to challenge the army of the West and win back Jerusalem. The final battle of the Crusade is yet to be fought.
Did you manage to follow the video with us?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, this gives a very quick run-through of how the Crusaders managed to get through to Jerusalem, to Bayt al-Maqdis, and to take it from the Muslims. As was mentioned at the end of the video, massacres took place with the entry of the Crusaders on the 15th of July 1099. And these massacres, even according to standards of the time, even the Crusades, from their accounts, what they did just inside the Masjid al-Aqsa, blood came to the knees of the horses. There was a bloodbath inside the Masjid al-Aqsa. People who are sought refuge inside this area, all of them were slaughtered, put to the sword. Jews in their synagogue, they were burned to death. Christian accounts talk about 20,000 or 10 to 20,000 Muslims slaughtered. Ibn al-Athir, a Muslim chronicle, mentions 70,000 were slaughtered just alone inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa, inside al-Aqsa Mosque. So you can see here where we started from in our class today, how the Muslims did not shed a single blood when taking the city 460 years earlier. We see the Crusaders now coming and slaughtering tens of thousands of Muslims. Some of the Crusader chronicles mentioned that the atrocities that they had done it cannot be even put into words. How they would open the guts of Muslims, how they threw infants from the wall, how they raped, and how they have done what they had done. It is incredible, in their words, what they had done to the infidels, to the Muslims when taking the city in 1099. This changed the history of the region. Like Umar ibn Khattab's Fath and liberation of this area changed the history. This brought it back to the way it used to be. When the Persians, 20 years before Umar ibn Khattab comes to the city, when they took the city, they also killed 70,000 Christians in the city. The Muslims had a very high ethics in dealing with the others, ethics of war. Now we come back to the bloody history of the city once again. You might ask, what was the response of the Muslims around the world at that time? How did they deal with this issue of the occupation of Bayt al-Maqdis and al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the slaughter of tens of thousands inside their holiest place? What do you think the Muslim response was? Let's start with this question. Let's go back to making this discussion interactive. What do you think the Muslim response was? And then we will continue the rest of the discussion. How do you think the Muslims dealt with the crusading armies and with the fall of Bayt al-Maqdis and the fall of the Holy Land at that time? Are we able to take some answers?
Yeah, we're just waiting for them to come in.
Okay, good.
Someone saying profound shock.
Yes. The idea of, and until the other answers come, the shock of this to the Muslim Ummah at large, how would it act? What would it do? Remember, the Muslims are divided. You have the Fatimids who aligned themselves initially with the Crusaders and now having to fight the Crusaders. But the only survivors in the city were the Fatimid garrison who were left to leave the city unharmed. The rest of the Muslim population was put to the sword. The other two groups that were not massacred were the prisoners, so those who were in prison by the Fatimids in their prisons. The Crusaders did not find them until days later. So they used them to clean the corpse of the Muslims. So their lives was spared. And some of the ulama, the Sunni ulama who were in al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the Crusaders did not kill them. The reason that they did not kill them was in order to find Muslims who would pay the ransom for them. So the Crusaders took these ulama and went to different cities asking the Muslims to pay extraordinary amount of money to free these ulama from imprisonment. And when this money was not paid, they slaughtered these ulama. Any other answers, Noura?
No.
Okay. So remember, this is the holiest place for Muslims, one of their holiest places. And you need to bear in mind that its fall is a great blow to the Muslims. But at that time, the Muslims were just as divided as the Muslims are today. Each state, each city had a mini state. So mini states or city states were the ones that control and each ruler was interested in his own gains. You see the Fatimids trying to strike the alliance with the Crusaders. You see even the Sunni rulers allowing the Crusader army to march through as long as they were not touched. The Khilafah in Baghdad was quite weak. However, some of those who managed to escape ran off to Damascus. Some people from Al-Aqsa Mosque jumped off the walls and went to Damascus to tell the people what had happened. At that time, there was no live news to follow what is taking place. And one of them, some of the survivors, reached Damascus and told Imam, the Imam of the great mosque in Damascus, of what took place. The ruler of Damascus was hopeless, so they turned to Baghdad. And the fall of Al-Aqsa happened in the middle of Sha'ban. And now we are in the month of Ramadan, and people are going to Baghdad, to the center of Khilafah, to meet with the Khalif, to tell him what has taken place so he would take action and do something. Do you think the Khalifa would do something? What are your thoughts? And if there are any other comments, Noura, we can take them until people think, would the Khalifa in Baghdad be able to do anything? Is there any other comments?
A few comments on how the leaders were busy fighting themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And no comments about what the Khalifa would do in Baghdad.
Okay. Until that comes through, yes. Unfortunately, most of the Muslim leaders, Sunni and Shia, were all interested in protecting their own gains and fighting one another. As long as the Crusaders do not affect me directly, then they were not interested in fighting the Crusades. The Crusaders, after they took the holy city, then turned to these leaders and took the cities from them. So there is a story we were taught as children that I'd like to share with you. I don't know if any of you know Arabic, the story of أكلت يوم أكل الثور الأبيض. Do you know this story, Nora?
No, I don't.
Okay, let's then tell this story. It talks about a lion who comes, and there are 3 bulls, and he wants to. He's hungry, and he would like to take them. So he gathers with the other 2 bulls, and he says to them, "You know, I don't want you any harm. All I want is to eat the white bull." And they say, yes, that's fine by us. So they give consent, and the white bull is eaten. Then the black bull is eaten, and then it comes to the red bull, and the lion turns to him, and he is about to eat him. And he says, I was eaten the day the white bull was eaten.
Yeah.
So the story of normalizing or aligning yourself with the enemy. The enemy, once he finishes with the others, then he will turn over.
Yeah.
So this is exactly what happened with the Crusades. All those, including the Fatimids and the petty governors of the city-states, all of them were then had to face the Crusades face on, and they were destroyed because they were not coming and fighting together. Anything about the Khalif?
Yeah. Some people are saying that the Caliphate didn't have an army. It was just like a symbol. So it didn't do anything about what was happening in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Let's
continue the story of Imam al-Harawi. Imam al-Harawi, who was the great Imam from Damascus, marches in the month of Ramadan with the group of survivors and goes to Baghdad and tries to meet the Khalif. The Khalif was busy, during the month of Ramadan. You have iftar programs, and he had so many programs that he had no time to meet with them. Then Imam al-Harawi goes to the great mosque of Baghdad and tells the ulama there of what has taken place in Bayt al-Maqdis. So they say to him, then you should deliver the Friday khutbah. And during the khutbah, I would like you to listen here a little extra carefully. During the khutbah, instead of delivering the sermon, Imam al-Harawi breaks his fast in the middle of the day on Friday in Ramadan. What a shock. This was a bigger shock to the Muslims, that a scholar is breaking his fast publicly in front of everyone in the month of Ramadan. I would ask you, what do you think the Muslims would have called him? They would have called him all names, that you are a fasiq, a kafir in the month of Ramadan on the minbar. You are breaking your fast. And they called the police, and the shurta at that time came and tried to take him down from the minbar. And he made a statement to the Muslims where he said, fasting and praying in the month of Ramadan is not less of a religious duty than regaining al-Masjid al-Aqsa. To regain al-Masjid al-Aqsa is more of a religious duty than just praying and fasting in the month of Ramadan. So this, he wanted to shock the Muslims who were indifferent to the occupation of al-Masjid al-Aqsa, who were indifferent. What can we do? We can only make dua. The pathetic excuses that we hear. and people who say this actually don't even make dua for al-Masjid al-Aqsa generally. He wanted to shock the Muslims and to say to them, wake up. To regain Al-Aqsa is more of a religious duty. Your first Qibla, to regain it is more of a religious duty than praying and fasting in the month of Ramadan. And one commentator said, actually, breaking your fast in Ramadan, you can make kafara by fasting 2 continuous months to make up for what you have done. However, to regain al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the Ummah has no kafara, has nothing to repay until they liberate al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So at this time, he was taken by the shurta, the police, to the Khalif, and the Khalif received him, and the survivors and the others and many poets said many very moving poetry and many statements to wake people up, to make sure that they feel what is happening. And Imam al-Harawi, as he was speaking, the Khalif, this is in the historical sources, unfortunately, the Khalif could not bring himself to cry, so he asked for water. And when the water came, he would take from the water and put it on his face to show that he was really affected by what was going on. Then he ordered that Imam al-Harawi would go to the different cities and raise a Muslim army to come and to go and to liberate Bayt al-Maqdis. So you can see here the role of one alim, and this was actually started even before Imam al-Harawi by another scholar, Imam al-Sulami. And Imam al-Sulami wrote during the siege of Antioch, of Antakya, he wrote a book, and this book then became very important in reviving people's ideas of jihad and the importance of Bayt al-Maqdis. So the concept of jihad that had seemed to have died out of the Muslim mind, the ulama tried to revive this concept in the minds that you need to fight against the enemy, and this is a duty. It's not just something that it's a luxury. It is fardu ayn. It is an obligation on every Muslim to defend these lands and to defend these holy sites. And you can see this being reflected in the writings of the ulama from this period on both the importance of Bayt al-Maqdis. So one part was the importance of Bayt al-Maqdis to Muslims, which the Muslims have forgotten. And the second part is the importance of jihad, which they have also forgotten. So it was to bring both of these and revive them in the minds of the Muslims. But this took a generation. It didn't happen over one day or the next. And actually, Imam al-Harawi was assassinated while he was trying to raise, to awaken the Muslims to stand against the Crusaders. And this did not pay off until quite some time. This took a few decades before people like Imad al-Din Zinki, and then Nur al-Din Zinki, and then Salah al-Din al-Ayyubi. It took, between the occupation and the liberation, it took around 90 years, 88 years of occupation before the Muslims were able to liberate al-Masjid al-Aqsa back from the Crusades, and to take it back and to bring it back under Muslim control. The starting point actually was Imad al-Din. Many Muslim leaders actually at that time tried to unite to fight the Crusaders, and Imad al-Din was the first to actually succeed in making a difference and liberating Urfa and ending the county of Edessa and taking it back from the Crusaders. But other attempts took place before these three great men, but these were the three major ones. The Artukids actually fought against the Crusaders in Harran, and the Muslims united to fight against the Crusaders and had a successful victory against the Crusaders. However, immediately after the battle, they started fighting over the booty, who will take what. And this showed you how the Muslims were divided at that time and not motivated enough. Some of the Artukid governors, actually, one of them continued to fight against the Crusaders in northern Syria. And one of the Artukids governors, who all of them were, their mother in particular, was motivating them, telling them that this is the land of your grandfathers. You need to liberate your first Qibla. You need to go back and take it. This was Artuki in the hands of the Artukids before the Crusaders came, and you need to go and liberate it. And one of the Artukids governors from Mardin in southern Turkey marched with an army until he reached the River Jordan. And then, as William of Tyre, the Crusader Chronicle, states, actually he reached the Mount of Olives. So he was literally opposite Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and saw the massive cross on top of the Dome of the Rock. What the Crusaders did to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa is they turned it into churches, into stables, into residence. The Dome of the Rock was immediately transferred into the Temple of the Lord, into a church. The Dome of the Chain was also a church. The Al-Jami' al-Aqsa, the southern building, was residence for the Knight Templars. The Marwani basement was turned into stables for the horses. The Crusaders turned everything into in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the holiest place for Muslims, into their own usage, and placed a massive cross on top of the Dome of the Rock. The Muslims, when this army that reached was not equipped with sufficient equipment and numbers, and most of the soldiers were chased and drowned in the River Jordan, tens of kilometers away, after trying to regain the city. But that was a failure, unfortunately. The real attempt started with Imaduddin. Imaduddin was the first one to put a strategy against the Crusaders. And Imaduddin, followed by Nuruddin and then Salahuddin, managed to reach the liberation of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa years later. We will just discuss today Imaduddin and take any more questions. So if you have any questions, please write them, and we will stop with Imaduddin and continue with Nuruddin and Salahuddin in the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks later in our next class. Imaduddin Zinki actually used to work for the Seljuks initially. He was born when Al-Aqsa and the Holy Land was occupied. He was only about 14, 15 years old. He was the first Muslim leader to have fought and succeeded with a real strategy against the Crusaders for the reconquest of Islamic Jerusalem. He took Ar-Ruha 45 years after the Crusaders had established the county of Edessa, and he was assassinated 2 years later while besieging one of the citadels, or the citadel of Jabr. The discussion, we will continue the discussion. You can see here the Crusader in green, the Crusader areas, and the rest of it actually was in Muslim hands, but the Muslims were so divided that they were not able to unite together and fight the Crusaders. I would like to share one final map with you to show you the extent of the Crusader Kingdoms. You can see in this map here in front of you, actually the map is quite large, I'm not sure if it's clear. This map here shows you the Kingdom of Jerusalem, so this is in yellow, and the rest of it actually extends further north. So the Crusaders extended their rule across the whole of the region. So the Eastern Mediterranean, all of this was under the hands of the Crusade. This became the kingdom of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Tripoli. You have the Antioch, and then you have Edessa. All of this, so you can see most of the eastern coast of the Mediterranean fell in the hands of the Crusades at that time, and they were able to control this region. Actually, with the occupation of this area, what happened is the Crusaders, most of the Crusaders who came with the First Crusade, actually after they achieved their goal, they wanted to return back to Europe, and most of them actually did return back to Europe. And this caused a big problem for the Crusaders in the region, that most of their men were just interested in achieving that initial goal. Once that goal was achieved, they wanted to return back to Europe, and most of them did return back to Europe. So the Crusaders were left in a dilemma on how they will repopulate this region. So they repopulated the region with mainly Eastern Christians and others from different areas, and some Muslims continued to even live under the Crusaders inside the kingdom, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. But you can see the extent of this. The county of Edessa was marching east into the Muslim lands, and if Imaduddin Zinki did not stop it, then the Crusaders would have taken the whole of the region at that time. But this was the first blow to the Crusaders, and then it took another few decades before they were able to the end of the Crusaders. However, you can see here in yellow, this area here continued to even after the fall of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and Jerusalem to the Muslims at the time of Salah ad-Din, this land continued in the hand of the Crusades for at least another century before they were brought to an end by the Mamluks a few centuries later. So if we can stop here and take any questions, Noura, and wrap up our discussion in the next 10 or 15 minutes.
We have like 2 questions. The first one is, why did the Fatimids turn against the Seljuks?
Actually, they didn't turn against the Seljuks. They were always enemies. One was the Fatimids were Shia, a Shiite state or a Khilafah based in Cairo. And the second was the Seljuks. They were associated with the Abbasid Khilafah in Baghdad. So these were two rival Muslim Khilafah, one based in Baghdad and one based in Cairo. The one based in Baghdad was Sunni, and the Seljuks were associated with them. The second one was the Fatimids, and they were always enemies with the Abbasids. So it wasn't that they turned against them. Actually, it was something from the beginning of the Fatimid Khilafah in North Africa that extended to Cairo. They were always enemies of the Abbasid state.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Was Imaduddin Zinki from the Artuks?
No, he was not. Imaduddin Zinki was a Turkman. He was from Turkish origin, and he was not associated with the Artukids. The Artukids, after they were forced out from Bayt al-Maqdis by the Fatimids, settled today in southern Turkey, around the city of Diyarbakir, Mardin, Hisn Kaifa, and they re-established themselves in that area. And they were separate from the rest of the area at that time. They continued to fight the Crusades, but they were separate from the Zinkis. Imaduddin Zinki established the Zinki dynasty, which from its outset fought against the Crusades until Nur-ad-Din actually had many victories, and Imaduddin had many victories against the Crusaders.
Okay, thank you. We don't have any other questions from the comments, but I have a question. Going on from what Imam al-Harawi was saying, the obligation of liberating Masjid al-Aqsa, in your opinion, what can we do to fulfill this obligation?
Yes, actually, his statement is as true as it was for them. It is true for us today. And having the first Qibla of the Muslims under occupation for more than a century, the time of Salah ad-Din and Nur ad-Din and Imaduddin, and from the First Crusade until the liberation of Salah ad-Din, it was 88 years. From the British occupation of Palestine in 1917, we are in 2022. It's been 104 years, coming up to 105 years. And the first step that we saw that the ulama took was the raising awareness of the importance of Bayt al-Maqdis in the minds of the Muslims. The Muslims today are in the same boat that they were about 900 years ago, when they had forgotten the importance of the Masjid al-Aqsa. And programs like this and awareness on the importance of Bayt al-Maqdis is the first step for the liberation of Palestine and the liberation or ending the occupation. Today, the world recognizes that Al-Aqsa is under Zionist occupation from 1967. They do not recognize the rest of Palestine, particularly what was occupied in 1948. They recognize it as Israel, but the international community recognizes that Al-Aqsa and East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza are under occupation. And the Muslims need to be aware that this is not a Palestinian issue. This issue is an issue for the Muslims, and the Muslims, even if the Palestinians do nothing, what we learn from the time of Salah ad-Din is the liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis does not happen from inside Palestine. It has to happen from outside. The liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis, we need to be aware of this, that from historical precedents, the liberation will only take place from outside Bayt al-Maqdis, and the Muslims need to be united on this. But the first step, which is important, which we have discussed actually from the roadmap of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is that knowledge and creating that connection spiritually, religiously, and politically with this land was the first step to liberate Bayt al-Maqdis. And we will see next class with Nur ad-Din. He actually implemented the methodology of the Prophet, the roadmap of the Prophet for liberating the Holy Land, by reconnecting the Muslims with this land spiritually, religiously, politically, and then taking military action leading to the liberation by Salah ad-Din. So So we have two excellent models that we can follow. The model of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which was fulfilled by Umar bin Khattab, and the second model, starting with the ulama at the time of the Crusades, continuing through Imad ad-Din, Nur ad-Din, and Salah ad-Din, picking the fruit of the liberation. Today, for us, the knowledge part is extremely important as the first milestone for the liberation of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa.
Thank you. We've had a few questions come in. One of them is, why did the Fatimid Khalifa not fight back to regain Bayt al-Maqdis?
Oh, he did. Actually, after, so you need to see it within the whole context. First, the Fatimids, who had a common enemy with the Crusades, the Seljuks, said to the Crusaders, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so let's work together against the Seljuks. So they both fought the Seljuks, but the aim of the Crusaders was not just to take the northern parts of Syria. They were interested to go directly to Bayt al-Maqdis and to take the holy city. It seems that the Fatimids were not aware of the real aim of the Crusaders. For this reason, they seem to have initially worked for them. Eventually, when they found out that they were not, they tried to defend the city. They failed. Then an army was raised by the wazir of the Fatimid Khalif, and he marched towards Palestine and had his soldiers stationed at Asqalan, which is next to Gaza today. However, the Crusaders acted faster and managed to defeat an army that was triple the size of the Crusader army. And the Fatimid wazir was, although he had traveled all the way from Egypt, he thought he will be going to the city, but the Crusaders came to him in Asqalan and managed to defeat his forces, and the Fatimid Khalif then had to accept that they had lost this land and leave it in the hands of the Crusaders. So they did try to take it from the Crusaders. However, they failed in protecting it and in taking it.
Yeah. Okay. We have one other question. What is the importance of Antioch to the Crusaders?
Yes, Antioch was one of the major cities, as we saw on the map, on their march. So first, to end the Seljuks in this area was very important for them to be able to continue. But it wasn't just Antioch. They also went to Edessa, Urfa, and other areas. And there are some, it was the first major city that they take from the Muslims on their march towards Bayt al-Maqdis. And they established in the area of Antioch the Principality of Antioch and the county of Edessa further to the east, and also the county of Tripoli and many other states within the region. But it was a very important center for the Seljuks, and they wanted to also take Aleppo and Homs and Damascus, and we can see this in the Second Crusade. The Crusaders, the First Crusade was the first, its aim was to take Jerusalem, and they succeeded in doing that. The Second Crusade came to take Damascus. However, Nur ad-Din Zinki acted much more quicker and bravely and managed to end the Crusader presence or their attempt to take Damascus. So the whole region, in a sense, not just Antioch, the other cities, but this was the first major city that they encountered, and they spent a long time trying to take it.
Well, okay. Okay, I think that's all for today.
Excellent.
Jazakallahu khairan
Thank
for
you.
this very important session, and thank you everyone for joining and listening.
And if everyone can watch the documentary of Al Jazeera on the Crusades, it will give more details. And if you have more questions, we can start with them at the beginning of next week, inshallah azza wa jal. But 3 series, if you watch them, I think you will find them very beneficial on the Crusades, and it will give you some of the issues that we haven't been able to cover in some detail, with some extra information that we have not been able to cover.
Yes. Inshallah, we'll share them with
Inshallah.
everyone.
Thank you.
Jazakallah khairan.
Thank you very much, Noura, for moderating this session, and we look forward to seeing everyone back again next in the next class, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.